Hi, Earl. Good to see you.
Hi, Uri.
And dear members and students of the IIGA, our guest today is a dear friend and colleague of our institute for many years. Dr. Earl Hopper is a psychoanalyst, group analyst, and organizational consultant in private practice in London. He is a fellow of the British Psychoanalytical Society, an honorary member of the Institute of Group Analysis, an honorary member of the Group Analytics Society International, and a distinguished fellow of the American Group Psychotherapy Association. A former president of the International Association for Group Psychotherapy and Group Processes, the IAGP, and a former chairman of the Association of Independent Psychoanalysts of the British Psychoanalytical Society. He is the author and editor of many books and articles in psychoanalysis, sociology, and group analysis. And he is the editor of the new International Library of Group Analysis. And I could go on with many of his titles, but let's move on. I have known Earl since 2000 or so, when he conducted a workshop on the fourth basic assumption in Tel Aviv, in Chaim Weinberg's and Pnina Rappaport Institute at that time. And since then, I have been blessed by a productive and sometimes even intimate relationship with Earl. And I still remember Earl, a delicious steak we shared at a restaurant in Prague a few years ago in one of the conferences. So, Earl, welcome. It is a pleasure to see you, and I am looking forward to our conversation, which I am convinced will be fascinating, since you are probably one of a very few living group analysts who knew Fuchs personally. Many of us in the IIGA are familiar with your many years of theoretical and practical contribution. However, I am not sure how many of us are familiar with your intriguing biography, especially regarding Fuchs. So could you tell us a little bit about yourself, about how you got into group analysis and into meeting Fuchs?
Well, first of all, Shabbat Shalom, Uri, and very nice to see you in this way. I wish it were in person, but you know, there we go, to make creative use of this. I think it's important to say, and something I've always felt able to say when I'm speaking to Israeli colleagues, partly because it may be a somewhat familial situation, but the capacity for intimacy in professional work, I always feel, is very high. So it also brings out of me a desire to be intimate in an appropriate way. So I think that the first way I would answer you is that it must have been 1966. It's a long time ago. I was at Cambridge still, lecturing. I was a lecturer in sociology, interested in psychoanalysis and group analysis. And in fact, I'd never heard of group analysis. To be honest about it, I had heard about something called group dynamics and the study of groups. That was something else altogether. But I was in personal difficulty and I needed help. I needed psychoanalysis or psychoanalytical psychotherapy, not that I knew the difference. And the only person I knew, you've got to remember that the psychoanalysis itself was not so very popular, at least in England. So it was almost a radical thing to do. I went to someone who was my mentor, one of my mentors. I went to Norbert Elias, who had frequently stayed with us in Cambridge. He liked my wife and my daughter, and I really had come to England partly to study with him. He was in Leicester, and I knew that he was the kind of sociologist who thought that psychoanalysis was not something other and split off from the study of social systems. And that vaguely I had heard him talk about it, referring to Freud in a positive way, rather than that he was some sort of villain or bad intellectual, which most sociologists did at that time. So I went to him and asked him for advice about who to see. And he referred me to a woman who was a friend of his at Frankfurt. He actually taught her to ski when they were children. And that's a woman by the name of Ilse Zeglo, who you may have come across before. She was the founder, one of the founders of the British Association of Psychotherapists, and later the London Center for Psychotherapy. And I worked very closely with her for a number of years, following, she became my training psychotherapist or analyst. She wasn't a member of the Institute. I was very close to her. Norbert was the one who made the reference. Now, Ilse was in a certain way friendly with Fuchs and the people around him. She knew him in Frankfurt, and actually they knew each other briefly in Paris on the way out of Frankfurt, making their way to London. And Ilse did groups and was close to a number of people who were in the founding circle of the Group Analytic Society. Walter Schindler, Norbert Elias was actually a member of that founding circle, Pat Damare and so on. And Ilse also did groups. So I was in a group with her as well as on the couch, and combination therapy that's how I started. And I thought that it was of great value. And when I took my first training case for the British Association Psychotherapists, I went to Malcolm Pines as a supervisor. He was already part of obviously the Fuchs circle, although I don't think he was a member of the founding Group Analytic Society circle. He was perhaps too young for that. But he was my first supervisor, and in psychoanalysis and psychoanalytical work. But I also then started doing all of the groups that were available. We called them then experiential groups and training groups. There wasn't so much group therapy in private practice available, but there was this transitional space. So I must have been in 3 or 4 years worth of groups with Fuchs before he died. Sometimes they were co-conducted with Harold Kay and others. And that was quite an enriching experience. So Fuchs I was also in a supervisory group with him, several people. And this was before the Institute of Group Analysis began. Yeah. But one of the things that happened, I was asked to do a radio program at BBC 3. This must have been in the late 1960s, maybe about 1970. I should have looked it up before we spoke. And it was called A Cure of Minds. We had 3 hours. It was a very, very big deal. And I interviewed a lot of the people who were founders and key players in the group analytic movement, including Fuchs. And we actually had recordings of various groups on the radio. It was a very significant moment in the legitimization of group analysis in the London area. So I had many talks with him then. I remember actually in the program, I later referred to him as Michael Fuchs. And afterwards, he reprimanded me a little and said, Michael is my more intimate name. Yeah. And I'm Dr. Fuchs or S.H. Fuchs. Michael is more a nickname that his first wife or whatever gave him based on a novel. It's another whole story. So I never called him Michael again. It was a bit of an Americanism, So that's how I got to know him. But subsequently, and we'll go into this a bit, I think Malcolm has also referred to this. He was not exactly lonely, but he needed a kind of, not an audience, but a kind of empathic audience. And as a young person, I must have been in my late 20s at the time, or early 30s. He used to invite me to his house for conversation, but actually it was to listen to him.
Yeah.
And he would raise a topic, and I would start to answer the question or relate to it, and he didn't want that.
Yeah.
He wanted somebody who he thought might understand what he was on about.
Yeah.
And he would serve you great brandy, Hein brandy, but not the ordinary commercial level, but the special level, the superior level. And you'd sit there, and I'm sure I smoked, and he may have smoked, I can't remember. Everybody smoked, and drank brandy while he would talk.
Yeah.
And I still remember quite a lot of what he had to say about people. But that was my knowledge of him. Yeah. And so we were both had a professional relationship, and then we got to know each other a little.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I interviewed a few months ago one of Fuchs' grandchildren.
Yeah, I read it.
You read it. And this is exactly the impression that he got from his grandfather, the way he described him as someone who was really yearning in a way to talk and to have listeners, to have audience. And this is what he remembered from his visits to his grandfather, that he was just a listener, sitting and listening to his long talks.
It's quite a complicated process because you weren't exactly turned into an audience or a witness, but you were part of something, but you didn't know quite what he was making you into.
Mm-hmm.
It was like, frankly, you became a kind of transitional object. And that may be it, almost a cultural object too, because he might have wished that he was back in Frankfurt 25 or 30 years earlier, but you were a new object of some sort.
That's interesting.
Something that he got off on, you know.
Yeah.
And you ended up feeling pleased to have been used.
like a good self-object, would you say?
Yeah, something like that, but I didn't have that term at the time. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But you asked me how when you wrote to me, you asked me how I remembered him.
Yeah.
More specifically, and I'll tell you, he was very refined. He presented himself in a very refined way. He was charming, refined, charming, and I knew him a bit over the years. He never needed a haircut. I mean, he never needed a haircut. He must have got a haircut every 2 weeks, I suppose. Perfectly. He was always very well groomed. He reminded me of one of my grandfathers in that way, who would have been very, very precise. But more psychologically, there's no doubt that what Ilse Zeglo used to describe him, perhaps in more private circles, as someone who ruled the world with helplessness. And he did convey this curious mixture of being an authority, took his authority naturally, but he seemed very helpless and a bit needy.
Mm-hmm.
And I suspect that this was also, I think he was very attractive to women of a certain kind. After all, he had many wives and many close assistants, and people looked after him.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think he was attractive in that way.
Well, after all, he was the last child in his family.
Well, yes, but he carried a certain vulnerability, but he was very easily hurt. He was kind of thin-skinned in my view. He conveyed a certain woundedness, that he was somewhat wounded and slightly unappreciated. And there's no doubt that building on that, if I would say he also was a little bit like he would pick up other people's ideas that he liked, and he would make them his own. Now, we all do that, and that's a creative thing. Now, he did that to Norbert Elias. Now, Norbert used to say the problem in Western etiquette in science is that there's a cult of individuality, and people don't respect the fact that ideas are really cultural phenomena, and somebody gives voice to it. Well, I've never quite accepted that 100%. I think there is such a thing as individuality, and I also think it's very important to give credit to people. But he was a little bit of a magpie. He would pick up certain words or ideas, and there's no doubt that he and Norbert fell out. You probably know he and Norbert had to repair their relationship over the fact that in the first volumes, Fuchs didn't give him credit for understanding the way in which the individual and the group, so-called, are abstractions, or two sides of the same coin. And Elias's work on the sociality of human nature really developed in Frankfurt. And although Fuchs was exposed to some sociology, that really was Norbert's insight, this interplay of the social and the organismic, arriving at the personal. So later on, he did give Norbert credit for it. But I remember in one of the discussions I had with him, I said to him that I knew that Norbert was put out in a way. Yeah, and he said, "Well, it was an oversight, but it's the only thing that I ever got from him. I didn't get anything else, and I certainly didn't get anything to do with clinical group analysis. It was only this insight." Yeah. So it remained, and that was typical. I had an experience like that with him myself. As later in one of my first books in 1980, I put in a couple of lines from papers that I had written earlier, and I had used the expressions in talking to him, in which I said the brain exists in the cranium and a mind exists among interacting individuals. And that appeared in one of his essays. Wow. And I didn't know whether, did I get this from the essay or did he get that from me? But there was this about him.
Well, thank you for this personal sharing. I think it makes everything so more interesting. You know, it kind of brings me to another question that I send you. And this is the fact that in a way, I have the feeling that unlike many fathers and mothers of psychoanalysis, Fuchs never elicited a vast interest in his life and character. It's kind of I call it a kind of a weak transference to him as a father figure of group analysis. And I wonder if you agree to this description, and if so, what would be your explanation for this weak transference?
I don't think it's true.
Oh.
I think it was very strong, and he was a highly idealized figure within the network. I think you have to see this kind of historically, and in that among the people who were close to him informally, they did look up to him, they did idealize him, but the institute and the society became institutionalized more after he died. So it created a different historical context for idealization. Also, it's quite complicated because in psychoanalysis at the time, and group analysis at the time, there was this constant search for the father, at least in England, where the Kleinian ascendancy had created a more and more sense of maternality, and the maternal object had almost replaced the traditional emphasis on the Oedipal father. Mm-hmm. And that had happened. And of course, the development of group analysis meant in a way that the father wasn't quite so important as he was in Freudian psychoanalysis, where the power of the group as mother and lateral horizontal transferences were explored and acknowledged. So I think that was the main thing. But actually, Fuchs was, in my opinion, idealized, and he just didn't have an institute at the time. See, Tavistock was very powerful. That was the home of Klein Bion. Even though Bion had gone to California, the people who had been analyzed by Bion were at the Tavistock. So there was a setting for a kind of institutional idealization. In this case, he died before that had happened.
Yeah.
You know, one of the questions that you asked me, which I think I'd like to go to,
sure.
You asked me quickly what I thought were his main contributions that he would be remembered for, and what might have been his difficulties. So let me say that quickly, because I think it could be relevant. I have no doubt that following Elias or not, he made it his own, and he made it clinically relevant. He appreciated the sociality of human nature, and he appreciated the reality of social cultural facts, which most psychoanalysts, if not all at the time, regarded as fantasies and projections. And the appreciation of the reality of a social fact following Durkheim, although he hadn't read Durkheim, was very important in the development of social psychoanalysis and in the development of clinical group analysis. So that, and out of this appreciation came slowly over a period of 2 or 3 decades, the development of the tripartite matrix, which really was not finished before he died, but in the 1970s, when he reminded everybody, we can't forget the personal matrix or the interpersonal matrix, in addition to the dynamic matrix, in addition to the foundation matrix. This, society, community, group, organization, person, body, this panorama of influences and their simultaneity and interpenetration over time was very easy for us to say today, although our students often don't get it, but it was a very creative and courageous thing to do in the 1960s and 70s. And it's almost hard to overstate the difficulty of thinking in that way and getting that message across. You can't, psychoanalysis was strong, and it was about body-mind. and the rest was, fantasy life.
Yeah, and I know how interesting and important and contributing is the idea of integrating social facts in your analytic work, how important it is for you. I remember this wonderful book of the social unconscious in clinical work and your marvelous demonstration of how you work with social facts in your psychoanalytic work. So you are surely one of the great contributors to this concept.
Well, I don't know about great, but the thing is, if you start life as a sociologist, this doesn't seem to be a very big deal. It's only that you bring it into clinical work, it becomes a big polemical deal. Mm. For example, in the 60s and 70s, well, you hear now Dick Blackwell going on and on and on about the fact that someone has a certain ethnicity or a certain skin color or has a father who worked with his hands rather than with his mind. Even now, it's important to be able to take this up in clinical process. But then, if you did, most psychoanalytical supervisors would say, well, I wonder what the meaning of this is. Mm-hmm. What do you mean working class, Dr. Hopper? Doctor, meaning sociology, doctor. Yeah. What do you mean? It's in your mind. In my mind that there is something called working class. You see, and that we didn't have that as a problem in group analysis. It's still very important. Yeah. But, you asked me also about his weaknesses or what the limitations were. Yeah. I think he would have said this too. I think he would have acknowledged this. He had two, I think, in particular. One, as in many, many immigrants, his spoken English in kind of discussion with you was pretty darn good. But when he was really reaching to make nuanced conceptual distinctions, his English was not good enough. And as a result, when you read him, I've often discussed this with Dieter Nitzken, when you read his material, it's often ambiguous and a bit confusing. And he didn't quite have the conceptual refinements, to make the stretch. Yeah. And in particular, he had this rather typical ambivalence towards sociologists and social psychologists, and who, our basic language was about group dynamics. Mm-hmm. And Bion, who had a different perspective, of course, in many ways, had a little bit more ability in this area and learned a little bit more sociology, as did Rickman. And Fuchs was actually more of a sociologist, but didn't have quite the language and conceptual tools, in my view, to say what he wanted to say. Yeah. For example, he thought, and I agree, Bion's concept of group mentality. Yeah. I regard that as a very primitive conceptualization. And Fuchs understood, well, actually, why say mentality? That's a reductionist word. You want something more like subculture and something more sociological or anthropological. Mm-hmm. But he didn't have the tools to substitute for it. Yeah. That would be an example of a problem.
Yeah, most interesting. Most interesting. I have two more questions that I wish to ask you, and we don't have so much time, so I will ask them and ask you for a brief answer. But it's so interesting. Okay. You mentioned before that in a way Fuchs died before his time, or at least before the institutionalized time. I mean, that before the institution was strong enough. And can you remember, Earl, what was the reaction among the group analytic community to his death?
I can tell you, it's an interesting question because he had become retired really for a few years before he died, except for a bit of work that he was doing on what was called Gay Pack, which was, the pre-journal, kind of like a newsletter. But he also was the conductor for this infamous group of the young people. At that time, I guess, even were in their 40s. Yeah. And that was his main activity almost. So a lot of people didn't know him anymore, and he was a kind of a figurehead. But there were two things that were strong. There was a sadness, however, of a general kind. But the work didn't suffer because people came. Pat Damare came into the journal. He wasn't in the group analytic practice. He wasn't seeing patients. So there wasn't really much of a repercussion in that way. But I'll tell you, there was a vague subterranean sense of loss and depression. It was never mourned. Oh. People gave lip service to, yes, we must mourn. Apart from a party that I went to with Malcolm, actually, we went together. He picked me up. We drove together at Fuchs's house. It was kind of little bit of a memorial. It was a very small scale affair. It was intimate. We ate, we drank. It was like Shiva. It was like a one-night Shiva. But I don't remember any memorial service that took place in any institution. And that was an important loss for many reasons. But among these reasons, I would say, you asked me what the consequences were, I'll tell you what I think they were. There was an intensification of unacknowledged rivalry, particularly among his first generation offspring. Yeah. That did not do us any favors in the development of group analysis and the Institute, between Robin and Malcolm and Lionel and Pat. And there was a reluctance to make Pat the new father. Malcolm maybe, but there was too much rivalry. Nobody quite knew who was going to be the eldest son, let alone the father. It was a problem because they weren't working well together and they would gossip about one another. They held it together. They did hold things together, but it was not, I would say, as productive
as it might have been.
Would have been.
Yeah.
Should have been.
Should have been.
The other thing is that there is no question, Uri, that there was a breakout, an eruption of sexual activity. Sexual activity. I don't mean symbolically sexual activity. I mean fucking activity. Yeah. Sexual activity between men and women and men and men and women. It was like two things happened. Like the lid of refinement was taken off so that Robin Skinner began to experiment with all of us in context of family therapy with sex films and sex therapy. We had an event together watching sex films about new ways of helping people with sexual dysfunctions and so on. I haven't seen that stuff. It was, well, today it would be pornography. But then you had to get a special medical license to show all of these films of masturbation and different sexual positions and so on. And we all went home after this workshop to change clothes because we were coming back for the evening's party. You know, every workshop had to have a party. Everybody was late because they were at home working on things. But this was typical. But in addition, and much more serious, there was a lot of boundary breaking that went on among senior people and not so senior people. with a collapse of authority. Now, in my view, this has to do with the sexualization of depression in connection with mourning that was not accomplished.
Yeah. This is fascinating.
I know we've got to stop, but let me just tell you one more thing that's interesting. I haven't thought about this for a long time. I'm going to say something which you'll say, oh, maybe not, but I believe that this was also true of Fuchs's personality. If Fuchs himself had really been able, I'm allowing myself to say this without real evidence, but hermeneutically, I'll allow myself, if he had been allowed really to mourn the loss of his mother tongue, and the loss of Frankfurt and Germany and everything that was happening following what happened in the war and so on and so on. If he had been able to mourn, I think that he would not have remained a Freudian psychoanalyst who continued to hold on to his belief in the death instinct. Yeah. He would have become a British object relations psychoanalyst a la Winnicott. Mm-hmm. Many of his ideas were Jungian Winnicottian, and he had moved away from Freud. But his inability to mourn European Freudian psychoanalysis prevented him from becoming that new kind of psychoanalyst. In my view, if he had, I am not sure that he would have invented, that's the right word, group analysis. To this day, I'm not sure that theoretically and meta-theoretically, group analysis adds that much to relational psychoanalysis with a full appreciation of sociality and the social world. Yes, it does technically. Of course it does. Don't misunderstand me. It's a big and important contribution. But the splitting, theoretically, may not ever have occurred. It might have been a technical matter, not a major professional identity and matter. And it relates to an inability to mourn.
This is a so mind-opening idea that you put on the table.
Well, there are people who wouldn't like it, but I like it because I feel it so deeply myself. In my own identity, constantly interweaving between being a kind of, I was the chairman of the Independent Analysts, the British Psychoanalytical Society. My identity is still, as I approach this phase of my life, it's more strongly what I've just said, a kind of social psychoanalyst. It's still very strong. And I resent almost having to worry so much about integrating.
There's just one more question that I can't, skip, and I don't want to miss this question. So if you had...
I'm drinking Armagnac, not brandy.
So if you had met Fuchs today, what would you tell him? What would you tell him of yourself or himself or group analysis? Is there any message that you wish to tell him?
Yes, I'm sorry that I was not able to appreciate the complexity and depth of his contribution at the time that I really knew him, because I'm increasingly grateful to what he was trying to do. Not just the development of group analysis, but the points that we're just making now. That's what he was trying to get at. And it's taken me, 40 years to get to the point where I feel a little bit more able to get what he was trying to say, although he didn't say it very clearly, I must say. And the second thing I would say to him, look at what you've achieved. Bion achieved quite a lot in his way, but, there's a living group analytics society. There is Agatin. There are institutes around the world of group analysis, not in America, which is a cultural phenomenon, because they don't understand the social unconscious.
Yeah.
They think it's about socialism.
Yeah.
And he would like that. The interesting thing is one of his great problems, I hadn't thought about this for a while. I used to think about it. There's a disconnect for Fuchs. He was politically conservative. He was really a middle-class professional German, professional man.
Yeah.
He was not on the left, really. He's probably center-right, know.
Yeah.
But thinking sociologically makes you more left-wing than you might want to be otherwise.
Yeah.
An appreciation of the reality of social facts makes it very difficult to be a kind of Darwinian organicist.
Yeah.
And I would have wanted to say that to him.
Yeah. I could go on and on and on. I mean, I feel like we've just started, but maybe the idea that, the two Northfield experiments, the one of Bion and the one of Fuchs, Avi Berman is going to speak about it in a few minutes. The understanding that both experiments were so productive, like you said, that Bion in his way and Fuchs in his own way contributed so much to psychotherapy and to group psychotherapy in particular. Maybe this is a very optimistic idea to close this wonderful interview. And I would like to thank you for really mind-opening. I mean, it's not closing. For me, it's mind-opening ideas that you are so generously sharing with us today. And you are most welcome to stay for the rest of this academic part of our study day to be with us and listen to the other ideas. Thank you very, very much, Earl.
Let me know when it happens.